which I know will be a very enjoyable evening. And so I'm going to do a formal introduction to somebody I think who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. Before I do that, though, I should just explain who I am, why I'm up here introducing Robert. It's because I'm currently, well, my name is Sarah Ansari, and I'm currently the president of the Royal Asiatic Society. So one of the really fun things in this anniversary or bicentenary year is to be able to be part of these kinds of events where we are honouring scholars who've made such a huge mark in their field. But anyway, thank you to all of you for coming this evening to celebrate the award of the Royal Asiatic Society Medal to Robert Irwin. This medal, I think, replaced the Royal Society's gold medal back in about 1990. I look at Nancy, she's our list. Was it? Okay, I've got my dates wrong there, but never mind. But just to sort of contextualise, previous recipients have included Edmund Bosworth in 2003, Christopher Shackle in 2006, Christopher Bailey in 2009, and then we had a double in 2014, which was Bridget Olchin and David Bevar. Anyway, I think everybody in the room already knows, Robert Irwin is an outstanding historian and scholar of Arabic whose career has been committed to advancing understandings of the rich diversity of its literary traditions. He's published many influential academic works, including most recently, if I've got it right, the very well received 2018 Ibn Khaldun biography, published by Princeton University Press. This sustained impact on intellectual life in Britain and beyond has been achieved through his scholarly and imaginative works, and through also a raft of essays, reviews, interviews, and so forth. However, I would say that Robert's scholarly engagement with Arabic, Islamic literature, more widely, has been based not only on a rigorous and extensive knowledge of primary sources, but also on deep personal experience of the living and lived realities of Arab and Muslim society. In addition, he's done a huge amount to advance public awareness of Arabic culture within British society at large. For instance, I'm thinking here of your work on the myriad aspects of 1001 Nights. What is remarkable, and I've said by many people sort of within the society, if not beyond, is what's remarkable about Robert's many achievements is his ability to write in a lively and engaging style, appealing at one and the same time to both learned and general readership. Moreover, as others have commented, his has-been done that authenticity is accompanied by empathy, by self-deprecating modesty, and by what one person described as an old-fashioned courtesy. Anyway, the society, the Royal Asiatic Society, has been committed now for something, well, for 200 years plus, to investigating subjects connected with and for the encouragement of science, literature, and the arts in relation to Asia. That's our sort of main calling card. That's our raison d'etre. And as a consequence, I think that the society is ideally placed as an institution, but also as a fellowship, to acknowledge Robert's distinctive and singular accomplishments. So, accordingly, on the Society's behalf, I'm very pleased to be able this evening to award him our medal, our Royal Asiatic Society Medal, for his unique contribution to scholarship in the field of Asian studies. I'm going to come round and do the honours, and this is where I mustn't rush, according to Nancy. You've got to take it slowly. So.
Feeling apprehensive now.
There you go. Here's the medal. I mean, you just need to shake hands. Anyway, I hope you like the medal. It's an elephant on one side, and then it's got the banyan tree on the other. And I hope, it gives you great pleasure. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going, just before I stop, I'm just going to explain what Robert's going to be talking to us on, again, this won't be a surprise to anybody. You will see the invitation, you've seen the adverts for this event this evening, but for the record, you're going to talk to us, give us a lecture entitled Tales from the Mamluk Crypt, Predecessors of Modern Horror. So I hope we all leave this room in a comfortable frame. Thank you very much.
Yes. Everyone. I'd like to thank Sarah and Shari for a wonderful build-up. I could listen to that forever. And also Alison Ota for arranging so much of this. And I feel that getting this award is like getting an award for eating a box of chocolates. This is no way to trivialize it. Quite the contrary, it's that it seems ridiculous to get an award for doing something which is just pleasurable, to write about Orientalist art or Mamluk painting or Ottoman history or whatever. I'd like to thank people, well, there are many in this room actually, but particularly Hugh Kennedy and Richard Delavie for stimulating conversations, many of them conducted in the back bar of the Star in St Andrews. And I'd like also to thank, well, I can't thank, but I miss very much David Morgan and Patricia Kroner, who are very stimulating people to talk about Islamic history and literature. I think that's all I've got to say there. So I will proceed on to the mysteries of the Mamluk Sultanate. I will start with Cairo's cemeteries. The two great contiguous cemeteries were located to the north and west of downtown Cairo in the citadel. Those of you, not many I'm sure in this audience, who are familiar only with Brookwood or Highgate Cemetery should put that kind of image right out of their minds. Caroline Williams's 1990s Practical Guide to Cairo describes the two cemeteries, Greater Carafa and Lesser Carafa, as follows. Each cemetery is a true necropolis, a city of the dead, but they were also areas of very lively expressions of life. Surrounding the tombs of the sultans and emirs are thousands of family burial plots. Many of those are courtyards, some open, some closed, containing cenotaphs and burial rooms. On Thursday evenings and Fridays, and on major feast days, members of the family, particularly women, come to the cemeteries to visit the dead. This has always been considered a pleasurable excursion. Today, one can still see the peasant carts trundling through the town, loaded with women in black melayas with blankets, cooking utensils and comestibles, heading for the cemetery. Others will already be there, seated in groups, picnicking among the grave markers. So it seems that not much has changed since the 14th century, when the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta wrote as follows. These people build in Carafa beautifully domed chapels and surrounded them by walls so that they look like houses, and they construct chambers in them. And here are the services of Quran readers and of those who recite night and day in beautiful voices. There are some of them who hold a religious house or a madrasa, that's a teaching college, by the side of the mausoleum. They go out every Thursday evening and spend the night there with their children and womenfolk and make the circuit of the famous sanctuaries. They go out also to spend the night of mid-Shaban, that's the month, and the market people also take out all kinds of eatables. So that's Ibn Battuta in the 14th century. And then there's Al-Kashandi in the early 15th century. People build beautiful buildings, pleasant belvederes, and manifest marvelous palaces in the cemetery that are such pleasant sights. The sites of congregational mosques, zawiyas, Sufi centers, rabouts and khankas, also Sufi centers. It is, in truth, a great city, but it has few residents. So the cemeteries have been quite lively, even if there were only relatively few permanent residents. But the cemeteries were inhabited on a regular basis by guardians of the tombs and by some Sufis and other hermits, and also holy dossers. I have no direct evidence, but it seems likely that many of those who went out to the tombs and the shrines went there to practice istikhara, or incubation. That is, they were seeking guidance from a holy man's tomb in dreams. As a young man in North Africa, I attempted it several times, but I never got any useful guidance. But cemeteries were underpoliced, looking at it from the other way, looking at the sinful bit of the cemetery life. Thieves were abounded in the area, and more specifically, of course, there were tomb robbers looking for grave wrappings and all sorts of things that might have been buried in the tombs. And according to the 12th century polygraph Ibn al-Jawzi, lunatics commonly dwelt in the cemeteries. And Michael Dole's comments that most of these lunatics were usually hermits living on nuts and herbs, and usually melancholic and otherworldly and anxious. Easy then to confuse the lunatic with the werewolf. This was regularly done. We'll come to ghouls eventually, but like the ghoul, the werewolf haunted graveyards and, according to popular belief, fed on corpses. But some Arab physicians followed an alternative tradition which derived from Greek predecessors, and they classified werewolfism as a mental disorder which caused the diseased persons to shun the company of mankind, to seek out solitude and frequent cemeteries, and roam about aimlessly with hollow eyes and lost in gloom. The 14th century historian Ibn Dawadari gives two tales about werewolves, both of which are located in the Karafa cemeteries. A couple of Arabian Nights stories suggest that it may have been common to sleep in cemeteries when there was nowhere else to lie down. A certain Qanim ibn Ayub, in the story that bears his name, returned to the city but found the gates locked against him because it was so late. So he composed himself to sleep in a cemetery, and there he spied upon 3 eunuchs who in the dark were burying a coffin or a casket, large casket. After they had departed, he dug up what he found to be a trunk, and inside it was a young woman who'd been drugged with henbane. And then the story goes on to all sorts of other strange things that happened. Again, in the story, Nuruddin Ali and his son Badruddin Hassan, Badruddin, on the run from a villainous vizier who seeks to have him imprisoned and killed, goes to sleep in the cemetery because he can't find anywhere else. And while he's sleeping there, 2 jinn come across him and then start arguing about how beautiful is he or is he not. And then the story goes on. Also, it was widely believed that the souls of the dead resided in these tombs, and there they awaited the resurrection. So it is not a universal Islamic belief. This was a kind of living death, perhaps. An anonymous French manuscript of the late 15th century reported that in Cairo, women go to the tombs and wail there incessantly, though without tears. The men eat on top of the tombs, and they leave the residue of the food on the tombs, and if later the inhabitants of the tomb comes out to eat it, it is a sign they've gone to paradise. I would have thought it meant the opposite. Manuals about unacceptable innovation. What sort of things people shouldn't do, particularly what sort of things women shouldn't do, are a rich source on the manners and customs in the big cemeteries. And in particular, the authors of Bid'ah manuals denounce women who visited the graves. hugging the muleteers who take them on donkeys to the tombs, to the cemeteries. And they particularly denounce women who play tambourines and sing and dance beside the graves and listen to preachers and storytellers. Ibn al-Hajj quoted the hadith, "God curses the women who visit tombs." It was unacceptable innovation to visit the cemeteries on the edge of Cairo, to listen to preachers and storytellers and pray to the deceased saints and provide miracles for the visitors. Aye, aye, aye. Now, for a few minutes of boring etymology. The verb qassa, to tell a story, probably derives from an earlier meaning of that verb, qassa, to cut or to follow a track. So track is a kind of narrative, narrative is a kind of track. Exegesis of qasas, that root in various forms feature in Jonathan Berkey's scholarly study, Popular Preaching and Religious Authority in the Medieval Islamic Near East. This was an important contribution to the religious and social history of Mamluk Egypt and Syria, more specifically an account of the popular culture of religious storytelling. The book has been influential, and rightly so, often referred to. But I do have one reservation. Berkey's book, which is a very good scholarly account of the ways, the preacher or religious warner, warning, you know, amend your life now or you'll suffer for it later, that kind of warning. And the cuss, he also deals with the cuss or storyteller, but in his eyes, he doesn't see it as two subjects. He thinks cuss is the same as ways. And I can't agree with him here. It's true that the ways and the cuss overlap, and you can find storytellers telling stories with religious themes and vice versa. But in general, the way is strictly a religious storyteller, whereas the cuss can tell you anything in this sort of nursery rhymes or God knows what. Berkey particularly relied on Ibn al-Jawzi's 12th century Kitab al-Qisas wa Madhakirun. And so those who remind, which is those who remind, perhaps is Berkey's leading source on this, but other influential sources, including Ibn al-Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Hajj, al-Suyuti, also feature as sources on the use of ways as a religious warner. And it's true, the qasas and the ways overlap. There are preachers who tell things for religious reasons, and then again, I think there are storytellers who tell stories, and just that's all it means. They don't have to be religious at all. There was right from the beginning in pre-Islamic times, the storytellers was applied to secular epics with no religious message. Indeed, there couldn't have been an Islamic religious message in pre-Islamic times. So there's quite a lot of pre-Islamic tribal law and a lot of stuff about battles and so on, which form the subject matter of the qisas. And the history of Alexander, for example, is also included among the repertoire of the storyteller. And regarding the overlap, some of the stories with overt religious content found their way into the Arabian Nights. They're usually short and dull stories, such as The Hermit or The Devotee Prince, but not always. David Pinot, in a short article with reference to pietistic tales that are part of the Arabian Nights, mentions one of the longer stories, which is also one of the finest stories in the Arabian Nights. This is The City of Brass. As Pinot notes, one example is The City of Brass. The Al-Layla redactor articulates as theme God's deathless majesty contrasted with human evanescence and our consequent need to prepare for the afterlife through a series of exhortations heavily influenced by Quranic phrasing that proclaim the vanity of our attempts at constructing works of earthly splendor. It's the kind of look on my work, ye mighty, and despair kind of theme. But no matter how much wealth you accumulate, you're going to die like everybody else. And it culminates, of course, in the city where everybody is dead, except the Queen, Padmore, if I remember her name, seems to be alive because it's the illusion given by quicksilver in her eyeballs. And she's wearing a lot of diamonds, and of course it wishes to grab for the diamonds, but they fail to take account of the fact that she's guarded by robots who are prepared to kill anybody who gets too close to their dead queen. And yes, in the 7 Voyages of Sinbad, the pietism which pervades the adventures, or more often straightforward misfortunes of Sinbad, are based on 2 qualities which are likely to be missed by the secular Western reader. Sinbad stories are really quite religious in their content. For Sinbad, when he's confronted by the beautiful and exotic marvels of the distant parts in which he travels, never fails to give thanks to the Almighty, who has created such a marvelous world to contemplate, and such an inventive God to have done this, and such a benign God to provide such fruits and so on. And then whatever hardships Sinbad suffers and whatever dangers he faces, he endures patiently and puts his faith in the mercy of God. As-sabr jameel. Patience is beautiful, and shida, relief after grief. Again and again, Sinbad is rescued, perhaps because he keeps his faith in God and God's mercy. In his articles on Qissa and Qas, 2 articles on the subject, the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, Charles Pellar ignores the possibility of the existence of pre-Muslim qisas, although they certainly did exist in the Jahili or ignorant period. Nevertheless, he stated that though the narration of the qissa originally had a religious purpose, this would change since some qisas began regularly to narrate stories which had no religious character at all. And Pellar goes on quite a lot to look at this, and clearly in Muslim Spain, because it's a purely secular thing, it doesn't refer to religious stories. And Pellar speculates that it may be at the origin of the picaresque story, picaresque narratives, which, as you know, evolved in Spain and probably did have a Muslim source. And looking at it from a negative point of view, which Ibn al-Adin did, Ibn al-Adin, in Aleppo, he urged that the Qas, like the fortune teller, should be banned from cemeteries. Most of the manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale, whose titles describe themselves as Qissa, such as the Knight's Story of Tawaddud, have no spiritual content. So after having been a popular exegete of the Quran and sermonizer, the Qas instead became a kind of buffoon who mainly replaced edifying narrations by comical and often erotic narratives. When discussing the Sira literature, the sort of epic heroic literature in the sense of popular folk epics, such as the Siras of Ansar, the Bani Hilal and Zat al-Himma, Giovanni Canova made the following observation. Qissa is sometimes used as a synonym of Sira, but like Diwan, it more usually refers to an episode or single story within the cycle. So much for etymology. Enough has been said to establish the Qas and cognate forms of that root do not necessarily refer to the teller of preaching village stories. There certainly was, as I say, an overlap, but there's no necessary connection. Now, hang on, yes, I skipped. When where were entertaining stories told? It's by the time Edward William Lane arrives in Egypt in the early 19th century, the coffee house is a common place to tell such stories. And the storyteller would probably spin it out in episodes and collect money as he went around from the patrons, or perhaps he was paid by the owner of the coffee house to tell stories. But the Arabian Nights predates the Egyptian coffee house, which only comes in around the mid-16th century. So where would these stories be told? I have difficulties here since I've been changing my mind about the whole way the Arabian Nights was compiled and where it was told and who it's told by. But I don't have time to go into all that. But certainly, recensions of the Arabian Nights predate coffee, and Conrad Herschler, in The Written Word in Medieval Arabic Lands, having remarked on the absence of coffee houses and the scarcity of suitable places for professional storytelling, suggests that Carafa was an exception, and continues with the following example. In the 15th century, two crafty individuals tried to tap the business opportunity that this cemetery and its pilgrims offered. In a remarkable joint venture, a local resident who owned manuscripts of Sirat Antar and Sirat al-Hama collaborated with a popular preacher to offer readings of these popular epics at the cemetery. So, and my belief is that we have placed, and I'm guilty of it, placed too much emphasis on the oral tradition in the composition of the Arabian Nights. What's really central are the workshops of scribes, often writing under for their own profits, their private enterprises, and they would produce manuscripts of individual stories in the Arabian Nights or a very large chunk of the Arabian Nights, and they would either sell them to wealthy patrons, it wouldn't be cheap, or they'd hire them out, and there's marginalia in several of the manuscripts to suggest that this is the case. And the readers might write a scrawl on the margins, well, this is a load of old rubbish, isn't it? And I think also there's some parallelism with Dickens in England. The person telling stories is quite likely not to be a professional storyteller, but the paterfamilias. He's gone out in the evening, he's brought a story home, and he's going to read it to his family. And I think that one needs to get away from this idea of the oral tradition of the Arabian Nights. It's also noteworthy that the sources of the core essence of the Arabian Nights, the oldest manuscript, which is of the 15th century, the oldest substantially surviving manuscript, where am I going with this, is, the stories are not really folkloric or not very folkloric and not often folkloric. They really rely on elements from high literature, often the bastard period. It's very much a literary work. One got misled by anthropologists and sociologists looking at the Arabian Nights and trying to find analogies with Albanian storytellers and whatnot. I think I and others have been going down the wrong route that way. Big dry mouth. So now, so storytelling would work. Storytelling in cemeteries would work. It would provide an extra frisson to the audience around 3 o'clock in the morning, sort of looking nervously at the tombstones. And there'd be a lot of stories about ghouls and other necrophagus creatures. And I've been struck by how many stories in the Arabian Nights do indeed feature cemeteries and ghouls. So now, ghouls. The pre-Islamic poet Tabata Sharan wrote a short poem about his encounter with a ghoul in the desert. Here is the second part of it. She sprang at me, then my hand I raised against her polished Yemeni blade. Then undismayed, I struck her. She fell flat, prostrated on her two hands and a throat latch. She said, "Strike again." I replied to her, "Calm down, mind your place, for I am indeed stout-hearted." I lay upon her throughout the night, that in the morning I might see what had come to me. Behold, two eyes set in a hideous head, like the head of a cat, split-tongued, legs like a deformed fetus, the back of a dog, clothes of haircloth and worn-out skins. Note the ghoul's tricksiness here. It was well known that ghouls could only be killed with a single blow. If one was careless enough to strike a ghoul a second time, then they revived. And that's what happened in the story of Saif ibn, Saif ibn Yazan, the ghoul, similarly asked to be struck again, and Saif is wise enough to refuse the dying request. Dark things happened underground. For example, in the nights, the first of the one-eyed calendar dervishes tells how when he was a young prince, he got drunk with his cousin, after which he agreed to accompany a woman to a graveyard and wait there for her cousin. When the cousin arrived, he opened a tomb and the cousin pulled up a metal plate, and this revealed a stairway. The cousin and the woman then descended and the prince closed the tomb after the couple. Subsequently, after various adventures, he returned to the tomb, accompanied by his uncle. When they opened the tomb, they found the bodies of the cousin and the woman burnt to ashes, at which point the uncle revealed that the bodies were those of his son and his daughter. Such was the penalty of incestuous love. The second calendar dervish story draws on similar elements, the underground setting and the secret passion and the unhappy outcome. A prince whose misfortune has made a woodcutter one day finds a trapdoor which opens, and a staircase goes down, which he descends to encounter a beautiful woman who is kept there by a jinn. If she needs to call the jinn for anything, she only has to touch a certain magic plate. They have delicious sex, but the prince, getting drunk, carelessly kicks the plate absent-mindedly. The jinn appears, the prince flees, but is recaptured and brought back to the cave, where he has to watch the torture and killing of the woman he'd been to bed with. Then the jinn gives the prince the choice of being turned into a dog or a monkey, and the story continues. These themes, this passion, illicit passion rather, underground setting and an unhappy outcome is refashioned again in the third calendar's story. After various incidents, a prince's boat sinks and he is cast ashore on an island. Soon afterwards, he observes a boy being escorted ashore together with a vast quantity of supplies, and the supplies are brought to an underground house, and then the ship departs. The prince then encounters the underground house, which is like a luxuriously furnished palace. The young man explains that when he was born, his father, a wealthy jeweler, received a prophecy that he would die on his 15th year at the hands of a prince. Nevertheless, the prince and the boy lived together joyfully in the subterranean mansion. We are to understand that their joy was homosexual. And then just as the youth was about to pass beyond his 15th year, the prince accidentally kills him. The prince then goes on and has all sorts of adventures. The story of Sidi Nouman, which I've mentioned already, is framed by the Caliph's night adventure. Sidi Nouman's wife, Amina, is a nasty piece of work. Since she eats very little at dinner, he gets suspicious, and one evening he shadows her to a cemetery where she settles down to a meal of corpses. which she shares with a ghoul. When the following evening he tries to get her to eat a normal dinner, she refuses and turns him into a dog. But then later a woman recognizes his true identity and brings him back to human form. And the story continues. He turns his wife into a mare, which he whips every day. And there are other stories of very similar themes. There seem to be variations on the same theme. There is a general tendency for the ghoul in Arab stories to be female and to prey upon solitary males. I could list the numbers of them. There are an awful lot of them. And Sinbad is one of the people who's almost ensnared by a ghoul. Cannibalism might be thought to be a distinctively European story motif rather. Ahmed al-Rawi has argued that ghouls in medieval Arabic literature, though certainly nasty enough creatures, were not portrayed as dwelling in cemeteries or eating corpses, and thence he believes his features must be European imports. So that's clearly nonsense, just from looking at the Arabian Nights stories, but also other folk collections and the sort of folk epics that Malcolm Lyons discusses in his 3-volume study of these popular epics, or summary of them, so analysis and summary. And indeed, Edward William Lane, who was in Egypt in the early 19th century, had this to report: the existence of ghouls likewise obtains almost universal credence among the modern Egyptians, in common with several other Eastern states. These beings are generally believed to be a class of evil jinnis and are said to appear in various forms of various animals and monstrous shapes, to haunt burial grounds and other sequestered spots, to feed upon dead bodies and to kill and devour every human creature who has the misfortune to fall in their way. But what is this compared to what I shall tell you next? During the caliphate of the Fatimid al-Hakim bi Amrillah, the butcher is regularly visited by a woman who buys a chunk of meat from him, a large chunk of meat from him. Eventually, he becomes curious and follows her secretly. She goes up a mountain before descending through a trapdoor into a room which has a window through which the butcher can spy what is going to happen next. The woman cooks and eats some of the meat before giving the rest to a large bear. Then she and the bear have intercourse 10 times. The outraged butcher bursts in, kills the bear and slits the woman's throat, and then takes some of her jewels. On his way back to his shop, he runs into the caliph, who tells him, and the butcher tells him what has happened. And the caliph says, oh, well, that's good. You've broken the spell that guarded the woman's treasures, and the treasures are now yours. The whole point of the story here seems to be that the caliph knew, the Fatimid caliph, it's obviously a Shiite story, knew everything. And it was just about how marvelous the caliph was, not how strange and horrible the bear and the woman were. As might have been anticipated, I've got too much material. What I should say, though, is it's difficult to read these stories. It's impossible to read these stories with the same mentality as those who were first told them or read them. Two things come to mind. The bear story and there are other stories of bestiality are quite horrible, and the all sorts of choppings up of people and so on. But that has to compete with the reality of life in Mamluk Egypt. And it's pretty horrifying to read the story of Sultan Faraj, who's told that the wife he'd divorced has remarried a junior emir. And so Faraj summons his ex-wife and he chops off her fingers and then pursues her into the lavatory and cuts her up there and cuts her head off. And then he summons the man she had married, shows him the head, and then cuts him to pieces too. That kind of story could be multiplied many times. It's part of, I can't say exactly everyday experience, but a lot of this sort of savagery went on. And secondly, we listen to stories about jinn and talismans and werewolves and so on as, gosh, that's fun, that's interesting, that's very inventive. But for people at the time, this was everyday experience. You know, they have a neighbour who has a gin in a spare room or something. You know, the stories all the time, and they're not regarded as a specialised form of fiction. They're just as part of life. I have got too much material here. I will briefly summarise what would be the second half, where I look at the late development of horror and fantasy as a genre in Western literature. This really gets going in the late 18th century, and it's partly it's a branch of the Gothic, and the early horror stories you get in Western literature are often Gothicized Arab romances or Arabized Gothic romances, which is the way you look at it. There's crucial figure in all this, unexpectedly, is Edmund Burke, him of the Reflections on the French Revolution, who published philosophical inquiries into the origins of the sublime and beautiful, in which he declared delightful horror as the truest test of the sublime, though the pleasure only comes when we realize that the horror we read of is fictional. Literary horror is a strange genre. It's pretty much the only genre that's defined by what the reader experiences, you know, unlike a crime novel. I don't think people read espionage novels or crime novels to get the experience. Well, it's not the same thing. And in the early 19th century, you suddenly get a spurt of horror, Gothic horror romances. The Castle of Otranto, 1764 or 5 was first Gothic novel note, gets followed by hieroglyphic tales, and then Clara Reeves' The English Baron, and so on. And then the first work of real lasting merit has never, I think, been out of print since it was first published. Rather difficult to know exactly what date it was published because of its very complicated publishing history, but around 1786, and originally written in French by William Beckford. This is Vathek, the wonderful novel, can be still read with pleasure and admiration today, and takes its name from an Abbasid caliph, Vathek, but gives him a totally fantastic career in sin and sodomy and horror, and he has to obtain the blood of 50 beautiful princely boys in order to get access to the treasures of the pre-Adamite sultan. And but then eventually he puts a foot or two on and ends up with the rest in the flames of hell. I would like to linger on this story, but I'll just quote H.P. Lovecraft on whom just a minute. Lovecraft described Vathek in these typically high-flown words. Beckford, well read in Eastern romance, caught the atmosphere of the nights with unusual receptivity, and in his fantastic volume reflected very potently the haughty luxury, sly disillusion, blind cruelty, urbane treachery, and shadowy spectral horror of the Saracen spirit. His seasoning of the ridiculous seldom mars the force of the sinister theme, and the tale marches on with a phantasmagoric pomp in which the laughter is that of skeletons feasting under arabesque domes. The next line is Count Potocki, Count Jan Potocki, whose wonderful novel, the Saragossa manuscript, probably say I had a part in getting published in English, part of it anyway. Polish Count wrote a novel, which is again in French, wrote it in French. It's Potocki had a profound knowledge of the Arabian Nights. He travelled in Muslim lands. He tried and failed to find a copy of the Arabian Nights manuscript in Morocco. And he produces a series of stories within stories within stories, and they overlap and play against each other in the way that Arabian Nights stories do. And these strange and sinister stories involving two beautiful young women who may also be corpses who dropped from a gibbet. It also involves the gypsy thief Avadoro, bandits, a Kabbalist, a lunatic, smugglers, ghosts, a mathematician, the wandering Jew, the one-eyed madman, and an ink maker. They're part of a literary phantasmagoria. Finally, to touch on the persistence of horror in the 19th and 20th centuries, there's H.P. Lovecraft, who was not very successful in his own lifetime, but as a writer of horror and fantasy, he was immensely influential, creates a subgenre of horror and an alternative universe which is full of unspeakable dreamings. And Lovecraft loved the Arabian Nights as a child, and he used to dress up in Arabian Nights stuff. He had a corner of his room reorganized as an Arabian Nights thing, but his mother to make Arabian Nights costume. And it's clear he was very taken with some of the key stories in Arabian Nights involving abandoned cities full of corpses and so on. Well, to conclude, cavemen in their caves must have related horrific incidents and fantasies. Nevertheless, it comes as a shock to realize how belatedly literary horror fiction developed. The Castle of Otranto is just about the first true novel of Gothic horror. And the rise of fantasy and horror in modern times does not drive straightforwardly, oh, Arabian Nights, boom, and that turns into Western fantasy and horror, because there are many sources, obviously. English folklore, Homeric incidents, Irish legends, Norse sagas, Arthurian romance, among the rivulets that come to form the mighty river of strange and terrifying fantasy. Also, the spread of the French and British empires in Asia and Africa raised interest in erotic stories. And the mediation of Galland's French version should also be noted for both the Saragossa manuscript and Vathek, as noted, were originally written in French, quite a lot, I think, to Galland as well as to Arab storytellers. Finally, of course, the Knights provided props for really good stories. The clutter of talismans, turbans, scimitars, concubines, and jinn, also settings, including palaces, but also cemeteries. Thank you.
I think I'll say what everybody in the room would like to say at the same moment, which is thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you for taking us on such a tour through the past, the more recent past, and getting us almost to the present. And I'm sure that within the room there may be some people wanting to ask a question or two. I think we'll limit it to not too many questions. It's been quite a long evening. But if anybody would like to ask Robert any questions or follow up on any of the tantalizing, tidbits, let's say, that you left us with, I open the floor to you. Or any other, reflections, perhaps if it's not comments. Maybe in the room people would like to do that. Any questions? Oh, yes, please.
What about the 21st century?
Yeah, what's first?
In relation to what you've been talking
about. Yeah. Well, there is, of course, a sort of subgenre of Arab stories, Arab fantasy, which draws on not only the Arabian Nights, but also on the Western Gothic stories. And most notable, obvious example is Frankenstein in Baghdad, a recent and very successful Iraqi novel, I think it is. Yeah, but I can't remember the author. There's in the 21st century, one's also looking at these strange computer games, which I don't really understand, but I suspect things like the Assassin's Creed and so on draw on the Arabian Nights. And if we're looking at Western, if we're looking at sort of British, American, French literature, There's not all that much, which is why I saw an opportunity and wrote a novel called The Arabian Nightmare.
Yes.
But I mean, I'm trying to think, who are the writers of Orient stories which have Oriental plots? Well, of course, the rubbishy Sinbad stories, rubbishy Sinbad films. They're really dreadful, and they bear no relation to the religious drive of the genuine Sinbad stories. The one great masterpiece, which is Arabian Nights, is begins with P. The Arabian Nights of Pasolini.
Yes.
It really is the only Arabian Nights film worth watching. But on that, on the theme of films, Dostoevsky's Saragossa manuscript was also made into an excellent film. Very long film, but it's got the essence of the stories in it. Nobody's done Barthe. I think. Yes. Oh.
I was going to ask one thing about Bartek, and that was that, of course, in the end, he did meet his fate. Didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. So, despite all the horror and violence, etc., there's a kind of retribution.
Yeah. I bet Beckford wished Bartek had got away with it. Right?
Yeah.
Yes. No, they're burnt in flames. Yes.
I enjoyed your discussion of this earlier period, of manuscripts as perhaps not this fatalistic, actually perhaps a rather erudite material. Can you talk about the manuscripts, what you imagined, how they circulated, how they survived?
I can only repeat what I said. I think that most of the manuscripts, there's so little evidence either way anyway. Maybe more will turn up, but and Conrad Hirschler discovered, this is just not a tangent, but Hirschler discovered that this tale of crafty Delilah, or Delilah the Crafty, in catalogue in Aleppo, I think it is, was alphabetically listed not under D, but under A, because he assumed the person looking for the Arabian Nights story of the crafty Delilah would look under Alf Layla. But that kind of piece of evidence is hard to come across, but it's wonderful when it does. It is mostly, it describes doing it either on spec or to commission. You know, and somebody will come to and say, I love this, even if they heard it first orally, I love the story of the dead. Can you produce me a copy and so on? There aren't many copies of the Arabian Nights, it should be said. It's not nearly as popular as all sorts of really popular epics, the Sirah of Antar, or the Sirah of Baibars and the other ones. So certainly the Arabian Night, you can't call it a popular or anything really, because it's not that popular. And when the Russells were in Aleppo, or was it Damascus? Aleppo, they had great difficulty getting hold of a copy of the Arabian Nights, and impossible to hear a storyteller. I was going to say, yeah, and some, as I say, some people bought the book and some people rented it. So I mean, I'm young enough, no, old enough to remember books circulating library where you paid to take books out from the chemist shop. On loan.
Any other comments?
I'm just thinking of our shared enchantment with Orientalist painters of Algerian cemeteries. And it's an entirely female space. And you have evidence of peace and insight and you know, the word or sketching seem to be male-dominated storytelling. The bits that we both touched upon are entirely feminine.
There's quite a literature suggesting that the Arabian Nights is sexist male fantasies, and hence the strange adulterous women and so on. But I think that's not a correct reading, because I think most of these stories are clearly in praise of women's ingenuity, their success, their cunning. They are admired. Well, Delilah the Crafter, she's a criminal, but there's no question but that she's admired. And outwit, if I remember rightly, she outwits Mercuriale, but I do remember.
Okay, well, I think that that's a good point on which to bring the formal part of this thing to an end. I'll just say again, it's been a great honour for us to be able to present Robert with the Royal Asiatic Society Medal. I think from his talk to us, it's just reinforced just, you know, the breadth and depth of the scholarship that he's been sharing with us for such a long time. And so if we could thank him one more time before we go on any. Please, I think there's still probably a little wine in some of the bottles. And
Before you go, you must have these two together. So nice.